All right, guys, the second part of the Chapter 26 lecture series, I guess. This is going to focus on political revolutions. Again, sorry about my spelling. Um, you will have a DBQ that focuses on this segment, so definitely pay attention. All right, so the first revolution kind of actually happened during World War I. So we go back to kind of chapter 25. If you recall, the Russian Revolution in 1917. Remember, this happened during World War I. And this is Vladimir Lenin. He led this Bolshevik revolution. The Bolsheviks were the political party that were kind of fighting for that proletariat. And as we remember, Lenin was a communist. And he basically did what Karl Marx advised workers to do, which would be to violently overthrow the owning or the bourgeoisie class. So a little reminder of what communism kind of focused on. This is a society or economic system, I should say, where workers would own industry. Now, there is a new term I'm going to kind of refer to as collectivism, and that's something a little new that emerges. And that'll happen a lot under Stalin, who follows Lenin. And so eventually a lot of the farms are going to be kind of put together into a large collective system where the workers kind of work or own the farms together. But either way, again, we're going to see the end of private ownership, at least in Russia, for a while, and the end of kind of private trade. So the state or the national government of the state, they're going to basically, run business, right? They're going to run business. It's interesting that the workers, in theory, share in the profits, but as the Soviet Union grew, the workers really weren't going to see much improvement in life. Significant improvement, at least, as much as, say, Marx had intended. The slogan was peace, land, bread. That would be a great little factoid in an essay. So Lenin basically establishes the Soviet Union, or a communist government in Russia. However, there was a civil war that follows the Russian Revolution. So in 1918, the workers kind of, especially the industrial workers, were growing actually frustrated. Things weren't going as quickly or improving as quickly as they had hoped. And they actually revolt against the Soviet government, the communist government. There was a lot of starvation and poverty continuing. So basically, they revolted. And Lenin kind of recognized that perhaps he needed to make some changes. So he introduced the NEP, or the New Economic Plan. It's a great little factoid to remember, where he acknowledged that private trade or some kind of capitalistic entity had to emerge. He allowed farmers to sell their own goods rather than limit, or to put some of, to help farmers improve a little bit. However, there was strict political control that continued, but it's a little bit of a calming down or a reversal of some of those radical communist beliefs. And again, the farmers were really not doing well because of the collectivism. And again, here we go with the New Economic Plan that introduces private trade. All right, so Joseph Stalin emerges after Lenin, and he's going to abandon the NEP, and that actually was a bit problematic. He introduces the 5-year plan, and really he recognizes that Russia has to get its act together and move away from maybe being an agricultural power and become more of an industrial power to compete with the United States and Germany and also Japan. He does introduce collectivized farming. This is an important piece. Again, when you write that DBQ essay, you definitely want to make reference to this. So he takes all of the farms that were obviously at one time under private control that became that were put under government control, and he actually puts all of the farms into kind of a collective. And he continues the elimination of private land ownership. And basically what it is collectives were groups of peasants who freely joined together to farm, but they had to follow, and this is the key point, this is the dictatorship, where Stalin had outlined detailed plans, and these farmers had to follow those plans and reach government goals. These farmers were not happy, like in the Civil War. They wanted to basically profit through their own work. And these farmers retaliated against collectivism by burning crops and killing livestock. Eventually, though, they did have to succumb to collectivism, and many ended up moving to cities and working in factories. So as a result, there was a lot of negative effect on the peasant class, the farming class. Millions were starving. A lot of low. However, overall, under his 5-year plan, because of the growth in industry, there were jobs. So these farmers who were not happy with collectivism did leave these farms, but they were able to find a job in the factories in the major cities. Cost of living was very low under the 5-year plan. And as a result of this growth of industrialization, the Soviet Union was becoming a military power. So again, overall, he rejects the private ownership changes that were occurring under the NEP, and he initiates a 5-year plan where there is greater government control, and that did lead to some rebellion. One reason why the Soviet people went along with Stalin was because of his brutality. He was as oppressive and as ruthless as anyone, including Hitler. He executed opponents. As we know, that his collectivism program led to famine. Anyone who went against him, or anyone who perhaps even owned land privately, that land was taken, and that bourgeoisie class was sent to labor camps or gulags in the middle of Siberia. Millions of Soviet citizens were executed. I mean, on a tremendous scale. He also introduced socialist realism, where he was very dependent on propaganda, Soviet propaganda, where he would use films and paintings to promote the success of his 5-year plan and basically the Soviet economy. Uplifting themes that demonstrated the positives of socialism. Even a book known as Cement by Fyodor Gladkov that kind of glorified working in a cement factory, if that's even possible. So he definitely, like Hitler and like Mussolini, he definitely relied on propaganda to kind of unify and elicit support for the Soviet system. All right, there was another revolution in Mexico. Mexico in the early 1900s was ruled by a dictator, Dictator Diaz. Porfirio, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. At the time, under this dictator, Mexico was actually under the control of a lot of foreign investment, including, American investors. The peasants were struggling. There was very little land for them. In fact, 90% of the land was controlled by the wealthiest 1%. So there was like in Russia, early on prior to World War I, there was discontent at the lower levels of society. Eventually, Diaz was jailed by the opposition candidate, Francisco Madero, in 1919, and that basically was a revolution. So Madero in 1911 kind of comes to power. He escapes. Diaz jails Madero in 1919. Madero escapes and organizes an army under Pancho Villa. This is Pancho Villa. And they end up defeating Diaz, and then Madero is elected president. That is the revolution, the emergence of Madero. However, although that he tries to appease the peasants, he too comes under attack, in a sense, by this guy, Emiliano Zapata. When you write your DBQ essay will compare and contrast the plight of farmers in Mexico and basically the Soviet Union. Well, Zapata recognizes that the peasant class isn't doing as well as they should be under this new ruler or leadership. And Zapata, son of a peasant, comes up with a plan, the plan of Ayala. And he declared that Madero was unable to fulfill the goals of the revolution. And Zapata seeks a new election to elect a new president. Using force at times, he ends up taking land that was owned by private farmers or the wealthy Mexican people, and he redistributes it to the peasants. This is similar to what did happen in Russia, but Zapata, although he did use violence at times. He promised compensation for those wealthier landowners, but often he didn't provide that compensation, burning haciendas and even performing executions. But overall, his efforts were not as brutal as Stalin's regime, that's for sure. But there is some similarity again and he didn't really introduce any collectivism. Basically, he took land from the rich and gave it to the poor. Very cut and dry. He didn't require the farmers pooling their land together and then farming that land in these collectives under government supervision. So he didn't quite follow Stalin's lead there, but same goal, right? Which would be to take land from the rich or the private industries and give it to the workers themselves or the peasants. Stalin was a dictator. The leaders of Mexico after Diaz were elected. They did have to abide by a constitution. 1917, the Mexican Constitution actually calls for universal suffrage and public education. So, the redistribution of land was actually, in theory, protected by this, or at least it was legalized by this constitution. So I think there were more examples of democracy in Mexico compared to, obviously, in the Soviet Union, that's for sure. Going forward, you're going to see democratically elected leaders emerge who, were not great examples of democracy. In the 1930s, Lázaro Cárdenas governs Mexico, but he ends up nationalizing the oil industry, which is socialism. The government is going to basically control and regulate the oil industry, and Mexico had a lot of oil. And that kind of angered foreign investors, but that was the point, right? To kind of put more money in the hands of Mexicans and help the Mexican people and not enrich foreigners like, American oil owners. So that's it. But so, going forward, Mexico would struggle politically. There would be fights over, who would govern and how to govern. But their elections were, elections, or their governors or their leaders were elected by the people. All right, China also has, we see a revolution in China as well. Remember, the Qing dynasty was replaced by a republic, but local warlords, and this was Unit 5, they kind of competed with each other. The central government that was in charge was very limited. China was taking a step back in a sense. After World War I, the sphere of influence kind of broke apart, and Japan headed in and took over, especially in northern China or Manchuria. So as China was kind of unraveling, there was also a battle of power. And it's during the early 1900s where the Chinese Communist Party emerges. So communism is spreading to Asia. And this is Mao Zedong. He is the Communist Party leader. Remember him, very important. And like Stalin, like Lenin, like Zapata, he too encourages a peasant revolt. Unlike Stalin, actually, he believes that it was important to focus on the peasant worker and not, say, the working classes of the cities. So Stalin believed, in promoting industry, satisfying the labor. Zedong wanted to, agitate the farmer, the peasant farmer. The other group that was battling for power was the Chinese Nationalist Party. More democratic. They sought to free China also from foreign influence and overthrow the warlords. However, they were not supporters of communism. And Chiang Kai-shek would be the leader of the Nationalist Party. The United States was much friendlier to Chiang Kai-shek, who was going to put together a republic. A democratically elected leader. He distrusted Zedong, and he initiates this Chinese civil war against the Chinese Communist Party. Eventually, he loses, and he and his fellow nationalists flee to Taiwan and set up a nationalist republic in Taiwan. One of the events that's symbolic of the communist revolution was Zedong's Long March. So he and his communist supporters actually retreat to the interior of China in 1934 to hide and train. It's a famous trek about I think it was a few thousand miles. 80,000 communist supporters began the trek, but only 10,000 made it to northern China. But it was important because it did attract a lot of followers and increase the popularity of the party. It could be a great document, describing the Long March, a picture of the Long March. But what it is, again, it's a symbol of the growing Chinese communist movement in the early 1930s. This is Chiang Kai-shek. Again, he's the leader of the Nationalist Party. Eventually, he wins the Civil War, and he does rule China in the 1930s. However, the people of China felt that he was out of touch. Again, he was friendly with the United States. He did advocate for some traditional beliefs like Confucianism, but like many leaders of the time, he suppressed free speech, and his government was marked by corruption. We probably supported him most because he wasn't communist, and it's that during this time, right, our fear of a communist spread of communism was so strong. We often did support dictators like Shek. It's also during this time that Japanese expansionism in China grew. The Japanese were seeking natural resources, land for their growing population, and that also fueled some anger and frustration in China as we would head closer to World War II and after World War II. Eventually, the two parties would unite in 1935 as Japan was becoming more aggressive. The two groups united to fight Japan. But after World War II, the Civil War resumed, and eventually Zedong would take over, and again, the nationalists would flee to Taiwan. So back and forth, but for a little while they did come together to defend China against Japanese aggression. Again, what you want to remember is the emergence, though, of communism in China, and that's the biggest part, right? Under Mao Zedong, here he is right here. That's kind of the history where we're seeing another revolution developing, and eventually in the 1950s, the communist revolution takes place. But that's the next chapter. All right, that's it.